Act 5. Against all odds. Kadabra and I had barely run 2 miles when a strange feeling washed over me. I skidded to a halt, dirt scattering beneath my paws. Kadabra initially assumed I had stopped because he was beginning to breathe harder, but the moment he noticed my ears standing straight up, he wisely remained silent. A moment later, 2 men stepped out from a small thicket of trees. Beside them walked a Hypno and a Talonflame, both Pokémon calm, yet clearly alert. The men wore Jiao Sharan military uniforms, though they kept a respectful distance of roughly 50 meters. One of them raised an open hand before speaking. "Are you Lady Fenn?" My eyes widened for the briefest moment before I gave a cautious nod. The 2 soldiers immediately bowed deeply. "King Callister sent us," the older man said. "His Majesty instructed us to watch for a ship arriving from the trapped sea. We only reached this coast 2 days ago, so we're grateful you arrived so quickly. We are agents serving directly under the king." The younger man smiled. "Do you remember me? I joined your escort after the Archmage rescued you from the kidnappers." This time I truly studied his face. Beneath the travel-worn appearance and military uniform, I recognized him. He had been the youngest member of the squad that met us outside the capital after my rescue. I answered with a firm nod and a thumbs up. The older spy reached into his coat and carefully produced a simple silver ring. "Lady, your appearance is far too suspicious. A member of the Fennekin line can only belong near the royal family. His Majesty commissioned this illusion ring specifically for you. It should make traveling considerably safer. He offered it to me." The ring slid easily onto one of my fingers. The instant it settled into place, a cool sensation flowed across my body like a veil of mist. I instinctively turned toward Kadabra. "How do I look?" Kadabra tilted his head, examining me from every angle. "You look like a Charmeleon," he said before grinning, "though you still sound like a Bracian." "Right," I nodded. "Less talking then." "It's perfect," the senior agent agreed with satisfaction. "Now then, which direction should we head?" I closed my eyes. The world faded into silence as I reached for the invisible thread that had never broken between Ventis and me. It was faint over such an immense distance, but unmistakable. I could still feel him. I lifted one arm and pointed toward the southwest. "Brakes." The 2 agents exchanged a glance before giving firm nods. Without another wasted moment, our small group set off together. The addition of 2 trained operatives and their Pokémon eased some of the anxiety weighing on my heart. Hypno's psychic abilities and Talonflame's speed would prove valuable if we were discovered. Still, our pace slowed considerably. Kadabra and I had been able to sprint across the countryside almost without pause, but now we had to move as a coordinated group. Every minute lost gnawed at me. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Ventis was waiting, and every instinct I possessed told me that time was quickly running out. The following morning, with little else to occupy her thoughts, Ventis decided to wander through the royal quarter once more. It was one of the few places she was allowed to visit freely. As the king's future concubine, the guards no longer questioned her presence. The royal quarter was strangely peaceful. Wide marble corridors stretched between the private wings of the royal family, their walls adorned with paintings, tapestries, and polished suits of armor standing like silent guardians. Large windows overlooked carefully maintained inner courtyards and gardens. As she rounded the corner of one of the larger corridors, she slowed. A large woman in an expensive crimson dress leaned heavily against the wall. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the cool morning air, and every breath came out ragged. One hand clutched her side while the other pressed against the stone for support. Ventis immediately walked over. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman slowly looked up. The moment their eyes met, her exhausted expression twisted into disgust. "I don't need help from vermint scum," she hissed between shallow breaths. "Stay away from me." She stubbornly pushed herself off the wall and staggered down the corridor, refusing to even look back. Ventis watched her disappear around the corner before quietly sighing. There wasn't much else she could do. The encounter lingered in her thoughts throughout the day, but eventually she pushed it aside. The following morning, while taking another walk through the same halls, Ventis found herself passing the very same corridor. She nearly walked by before spotting the familiar woman collapsed against the same wall. Her condition had worsened dramatically. Face was pale as paper, sweat soaked through her dress, and her entire body trembled uncontrollably. One hand desperately clutched her stomach while the other on the wall as another wave of pain overtook her. Ventis hurried over. "You're still here? Leave," the woman barely whispered. Ventis crouched down, intending to help her sit upright, but then her eyes fell to the ground. A small puddle of clear liquid had formed beneath the woman's dress. Her gaze slowly traveled upward to the woman's stomach. "You're pregnant." Another cry escaped the noblewoman as she doubled over. The realization struck Ventis immediately. Without another thought, she thrust out both hands. Levitation. Soft blue mana wrapped around the woman before gently lifting her into the air. "What are you doing?" "I don't care what you call me," Ventis replied as she hurried toward her own concubine room. "You're not giving birth on a corridor." The woman tried to protest, but another contraction robbed her of both her voice and strength. By the time they reached Ventis's room, she could do little more than grit her teeth. Ventis pushed the door open with a pulse of mana before carefully lowering the woman onto the bed. Only then did reality finally catch up with her. She stared at the woman. I've never helped deliver a baby before." There wasn't a single maid in sight. No healer, no servants. Somehow, the entire walk back had been completely deserted. "I need help!" She hurried toward the door and reached for the handle. "No!" The desperate scream made Ventis freeze. She turned around. The woman had somehow forced herself halfway upright despite the pain, terror filling her pale face. "No one," she gasped between breaths. "No one can know about this." I felt panic emanating from Ventis and immediately opened my mind to her. "Ventis, what is going on?" I asked hurriedly. I have an issue," Ventis replied, her thoughts trembling. "There is a woman giving birth next to me, and I don't think I can ask anyone for help. I nearly tripped in the middle of our run. I'm not a doctor," I admitted. "I can only tell you what I remember from movies and what little I learned in school. Better than nothing." I could almost feel her nod. I raised a hand, signaling everyone to stop. The others immediately came to a halt while I sat down on the grass and focused, opening one eye to see through Ventis's vision. "Whoa, that's one fat woman. Fenn!" "Sorry." I shook my head, refocusing. "Get some water boiling and wash a towel or two in it to sterilize them. Then help her into a less painful position." I wasn't remotely qualified for this, but in a situation like this, even scraps of modern knowledge could make a difference. We didn't need to perform miracles. We just had to keep both the mother and the baby alive. Ventis carefully helped the exhausted woman into a position I vaguely remembered seeing on television before encouraging her to take slow, deep breaths between contractions. "Keep breathing. Nice, deep breaths." I continued, giving whatever advice I could remember. "Support the baby as it comes out. Watch for the umbilical cord around its neck. If it's wrapped around, gently loosen it. And make sure one of those clean towels is ready." To my surprise, the birth progressed quickly. Barely 5 minutes later, the baby's head emerged. One final push, followed by a cry of pain from the mother, and the rest of the tiny body slipped free into Ventis's waiting hands. Without hesitation, Ventis cast the pain reduction spell she had learned from one of the books in the Royal Library. It had originally been designed to dull the agony of wounded soldiers on the battlefield, but at that moment, its purpose hardly mattered. "Quickly!" I shouted. "Hold the baby securely and give it a gentle pat on the back. It needs to start breathing." Ventis did exactly that. After carefully cutting the umbilical cord with a pair of scissors she had sterilized over a flame, she lifted the newborn and gently patted its back. For a single terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the baby inhaled sharply before letting out a loud, healthy cry that echoed through the room. The sound washed over both of us like a wave. I slowly slumped sideways where I sat on the roadside, only now realizing just how tense I had been. It took nearly half an hour before the room finally settled into silence. Ventis cleaned what she could, carrying away the bloodied cloths and replacing them with fresh ones. The boiled towels had proven invaluable, and once everything was finished, she carefully washed the newborn with warm water before wrapping him snugly in a clean towel. Only then did she place him into his mother's waiting arms. The woman held him with trembling hands, tears quietly streaming down her cheeks as she looked upon the tiny face nestled against her chest. "A boy," she whispered. The infant let out a tiny yawn before settling comfortably against her warmth, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding his very existence. "He looks healthy," Ventis said with a relieved smile. "That's good." The woman gave a weak nod before her expression slowly darkened. "Lady Ventis," she hesitated, glancing toward the closed door. "What I'm about to tell you must never leave this room." Ventis's smile faded. "I promise." The woman looked back down at her son, gently stroking his tiny cheek. "This child must be kept secret from the current king." Ventis blinked. "Why?" "Because he may decide to kill him." The words were spoken so quietly they almost disappeared into the room. "My son!" Her voice trembled. "He is the only son of King Rhaegus Dravosh." Ventis's eyes widened. The woman slowly closed hers. "I was one of Rhaegus's concubines. I only realized I was carrying his child as the war started. I thought I was only sick." Her arms instinctively tightened around the infant. "If Calith learns that Rhaegus left behind a legitimate son, one with royal blood," she swallowed, "he will never allow him to grow up. Even as a baby, he would be seen as a threat." Silence filled the room. Ventis stared at the sleeping child. He had entered the world only minutes ago, yet a death sentence already hung over his head. The woman looked down at him once more, a gentle smile finally returning to her weary face. "His name," she softly brushed a finger across the baby's forehead, "will be Roaran." The newborn stirred slightly at the sound before drifting back to sleep. "I won't tell anyone." Ventis smiled. The exhausted woman smiled gratefully, before her eyelids grew heavy. The birth had drained what little strength she had left. Fortunately, very few people ever came near Ventis's assigned quarters. The room, isolated from the other concubines due to her unusual status, had become the safest hiding place either of them could have hoped for. For the following days, the former concubine remained there in secret, resting and slowly recovering from the birth, while Ventis quietly brought meals, fresh water, and clean linens whenever she could. Every trip through the royal quarter was made with careful timing, ensuring no curious servants or guards would question why she carried enough food for two. As for little Roaran, he spent most of his days sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that the room sheltering him had become the only thing standing between him and the ambitions of a king. The gates of Ragefire stood wide open as the victorious army approached. Long before the first soldiers entered the capital, the streets had filled with cheering citizens. Crimson and gold banners bearing the Dravosh crest fluttered from windows and balconies, while merchants abandoned their stalls to watch the procession. Children squeezed through the crowd for a better view, and flower petals rained from above as nobles and commoners alike celebrated what they believed to be the dawn of a new era. At the head of the procession rode King Calith Dravosh atop a magnificent pale rapidash. Its flames burned a light blue rather than the usual orange, giving the Pokémon an almost regal appearance. Calith wore polished black armor beneath a royal crimson cloak, the newly forged crown resting comfortably upon his head. "Long live King Calith! Glory to Jaushara! Victory to the Dragon King!" The cheers rolled through the streets like thunder. Calith acknowledged the people with the occasional wave, though his expression remained composed. He had expected this reception. Victories were celebrated, and the conquest of the Riverlands had been the greatest military success Jaushara had achieved in generations. Riding just behind him was General Varenus Ashkar, mounted upon a mudsdale. Unlike the celebrating citizens, the veteran general's attention remained on the soldiers lining the streets and the disciplined formation of the returning army. "It seems the people truly believe the war is already won," Varenus remarked quietly. "They should," Calith replied without looking back. "As far as they can see, it is." The general allowed himself a small smile. "The riverlands are ours. The supply roads are secured, and reports from the governors indicate that resistance has been minimal. It will remain that way." Calith's gaze drifted toward the distant castle rising above the city. "The 17 defense constructs should all be operational." Varenus nodded. "As every occupied settlement is protected by one, Vermont would need to commit overwhelming force just to reclaim a single town. And by doing so," Calith continued, "they expose themselves elsewhere." "It was a brilliant and elegant strategy," praised the general. Calith smiled faintly and gently patted Rapidash's neck as the Pokémon continued its measured pace through the cheering streets. "The Riverlands will become a wall they cannot climb." Varenus glanced toward the endless columns of soldiers marching behind them. "We left just over 30,000 troops to garrison the occupied territory." "More than enough," Calith answered. "With the constructs supporting them, those men are worth several times their number. Vermont cannot retake the Riverlands without first destroying the towers, and destroying even one will cost them dearly." The procession slowly climbed the final avenue leading toward the royal castle. More flower petals drifted through the air as musicians played triumphant marches from balconies overlooking the road. The great gates of the palace opened, revealing rows of servants and royal guards standing at perfect attention. Calith looked upon the castle that now belonged solely to him. "The first move is complete." His eyes lingered on the towering keep ahead. "Now we make sure the board remains exactly as I've arranged it." The celebrations continued behind them, their cheers echoing across the capital as the victorious king disappeared into the royal castle, already thinking several moves ahead. Unlike the celebrations filling Ragefire, the atmosphere within Vermont's royal war chamber was heavy and subdued. King Callister stood silently before the great map covering the center of the room. New reports arrived almost hourly, each one marked with another colored pin. Red for occupied settlements, blue for Vermont's remaining strongholds, and white for the countless refugee columns slowly making their way deeper into the kingdom. The war had entered a new stage. Ironically, food itself was not the problem. Vermont's fertile heartlands had produced abundant harvests for decades, and the royal granaries remained well stocked. Even with hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians, there was enough grain to keep everyone fed. The true enemy was distance. Entire villages had fled with little more than the clothes on their backs. Some had walked for weeks before reaching safety, while supply wagons struggled to reach the ever-changing refugee camps. One settlement would suddenly house thousands of exhausted civilians, while another remained nearly empty, forcing quartermasters to constantly redirect food, blankets, healers, and livestock across the kingdom. It was a logistical nightmare. Callister quietly studied the reports before making his decision. A royal distress order would be issued before sunset. Every governor, mayor, village, elder, guild, temple, monastery, and noble estate throughout Vermont would receive the same command. Wagons, Pokémon livestock, grain, medicine, craftsmen, and volunteers would all be redirected toward the eastern provinces until the crisis had passed. The order alone would cost the treasury a fortune. Callister accepted that without hesitation. Gold locked inside vaults served no purpose while his own people slept beneath open skies. His attention shifted farther west, stopping near the second bastion. Behind the massive fortress stretched an enormous expanse of fertile plains. The region possessed rich farmland, access to fresh water, and, most importantly, lay safely behind one of Vermont's strongest defensive positions. It was the perfect location. Builders from every major city were to gather near the second bastion. Architects, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, laborers, Anyone capable of raising homes, workshops, roads, mills, and defensive walls would be summoned under royal authority. A new city would rise there. It would become a refuge for those who had lost everything in the Riverlands, giving them land to cultivate and homes to rebuild instead of leaving them dependent on royal aid. The surrounding fields could be planted before winter's end, and if fortune favored them, the first harvest the following year would already begin feeding the growing settlement. The undertaking was staggering. Thousands of workers, millions of bricks, a small forest worth of timber. The project would drain a third of the royal treasury before its foundations were even complete. Even so, Callister never considered abandoning the idea. If Jaushara had taken part of Vermont, then the answer was not merely to mourn what had been lost. Vermont would grow stronger with what remained. His gaze eventually returned to the occupied Riverlands. Every instinct urged him to retaliate immediately. Every report of another captured village fueled the desire to march east and reclaim what had been stolen before Jaushara could entrench itself. But instinct was precisely what concerned him. Kylith had not behaved like an overconfident conqueror. His campaign had been deliberate, methodical, and strangely restrained. He had advanced only as far as his preparations allowed, before abruptly stopping. That alone made Callister uneasy. There was another move waiting beyond the horizon. He simply had yet to see it. The temptation to attack was strong, but rushing forward without understanding his opponent's intentions would be exactly the mistake Calith hoped for. Callister slowly folded his hands behind his back. The Riverlands would be reclaimed. He believed that, without the slightest doubt, but wars between patient rulers were not decided by the first victory. Callister sat alone on the palace balcony, a weary look upon his face as he gazed over the sprawling hedge maze below. For weeks, every waking hour had been spent dealing with the kingdom's internal struggles. Nobles, leaking funds, possible plots against Ventis and Fenn. In doing so, he had truly underestimated Jaushara. A glass of water rested in his hand. The bottle of wine sitting nearby remained untouched. Behind him, an unfinished chess match waited on a small table. The black and white pieces stood frozen mid-game, abandoned several weeks ago when the first reports from the Riverlands had arrived. "Sire?" A man dressed in dark clothing emerged from the shadows as though he had always been there. Neither Callister nor the Empoleon standing faithfully beside him showed the slightest surprise. "I have good news," the agent reported with a respectful bow. "Our operatives have successfully met Lady Fenn. They are now traveling together. At last, some welcome news." "Good," Callister replied quietly. "We've suffered a heavy blow. It's time we returned the favor." He took a slow sip of water before asking, "How many scrolls did they bring?" "7, Your Majesty." Callister gave a thoughtful nod. "That should be enough." The agent bowed once more before stepping backward into the shade. Within moments, he had vanished completely, leaving only the rustling leaves behind. Not long afterward, another set of footsteps approached. Unlike the silent spy, Archmage Gehatu made no effort to conceal his presence. The elderly mage strolled across the balcony with his usual relaxed pace before taking a seat opposite the king. "I've completed my preparations as well," he said. "The teleportation array has been attuned to the ring given to Lady Fenn. The moment the signal is sent, everyone within the spell's radius around the ring will be transported here." Callister nodded, his eyes remaining fixed on the gardens below. "Have several Aura Knights standing by." Gehatu raised an eyebrow. "In case I accidentally summon Jausharan forces too?" The Archmage chuckled. "A reasonable precaution." For a few moments, neither man spoke. The breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying with it the scent of the palace gardens. Finally, Callister broke the silence. The future Archmage of Vermont must be brought home. There was no hesitation in his voice. Gehatu inclined his head. "She will be—" The late summer wind stirred the leaves of the hedge maze below, carrying with it the first unmistakable chill of the coming autumn. Before long, the seasons would change. The summons came shortly after midday. A royal attendant knocked politely on Ventis's door before escorting her through the familiar halls of the castle. The route ended at one of the king's private chambers, where 2 royal guards silently stepped aside to allow her entry. Caliph stood beside an open window, his back turned as he overlooked the palace gardens. He remained silent for several moments after she entered, only acknowledging her presence once the heavy doors closed behind her. "You've settled in well." "I have, Your Majesty," Ventis said with a bow. He slowly turned to face her. "You even made a new friend in the librarian. Cute girl, but not my type. Still a valuable piece in my collection." He chuckled, then faced her with greed in his eyes. "I've decided there is no reason to delay any longer." Ventis met his eyes but said nothing. "Our wedding will take place 4 days from now." He leaned in and playfully ran his finger on her shoulder and back. "The preparations have already begun. Tailors will visit tomorrow, and the court has been informed." He walked behind her to the glass cabinet and poured something sweet-smelling. "Don't be sad that you are only my 3rd wife. Here in Jaushara, a king can have as many concubines as he wants," he said, and gave Ventis 1 glass. "Drink," he raised his own. "Let us celebrate my victory and our future." His smile was all teeth, his usual mask nowhere to be seen. Without asking, he reached out and gently lifted a strand of her lavender hair with his fingers, studying it with quiet fascination. "I made sure that no one would lift a finger if they say abrasion in my country. In fact, everyone is ordered to help her get to you. Make sure she is act the part." He petted Ventis's face lightly. Ventis resisted every instinct, telling her to recoil. Caliph smiled faintly. "You'll grow accustomed to this castle. It is your home now." The words carried no warmth, only certainty. "You belong here, to me." Ventis lowered her gaze, hiding the disgust threatening to surface. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good." He stepped back as though the matter had already been settled. "In 4 days you'll stand beside me before the kingdom. After that." His usual smile returned, a fake and noble facade. "There will be no further need for separate chambers." Caliph turned away, dismissing her with a casual wave of his hand. "You may go. Rest while you can." Only after leaving the room and hearing the doors close behind her did she finally allow herself to breathe again. Her fists were clenched so hard they shook. She was really close to blast that filth in the face with a wind blade, but she also felt that his enchanted rings would defend him. She walked the corridor and gritted her teeth. Soon. I was alarmed by the emotions suddenly flooding through my bond with Ventis just as we were setting up camp for the night. No matter how fast we traveled, there was a limit. If we ran day and night without rest, we'd arrive too exhausted to fight, and that would help no one. I immediately opened my mind to her. "Ventis?" she answered almost at once. "He?" She hesitated. He acted like I was already his. He said after the wedding there would be no need for separate chambers anymore. My claws dug into the ground. "I'm here. 3 days. I looked toward the dark horizon. "We'll be there in 3 days. I'll make sure of it." The fear within our bond eased slightly. "Okay." The connection faded, leaving me staring silently into the campfire. Thankfully, we managed to get some important information out of a few soldiers. Minerna, the older royal agent, walked over and tossed me a leather Pokémon collar. I caught it before it hit the ground. The Jiao Sharan Magic Institute made a number of changes over the last 6 years, he explained while pulling a bronze identification tag from his pocket. Apparently, every Pokémon collar and military insignia issued within the kingdom is linked to a specific enchantment. He handed me the metal tag. If we enter a city, or worse, the capital, without one of these, the defensive towers will identify us as intruders and attack the moment we come within range. Doesn't matter whether you're human or Pokémon. The new magic slate he have me was amazing. It did not require chalk, only me using my claw to gently write. Wait. I examined the collar carefully, searching for traces of restriction magic, finding that part being damaged beyond recovery. So, I nodded. Wouldn't that kill every random wild Pokémon wandering nearby? Oh no, Minerva shook his head. Only collared Pokémon are checked. Wild Pokémon aren't considered part of the system. Because every owned Pokémon wears a collar, I finished. He nodded. Exactly. I turned the collar over in my hands, studying the intricate runes carved into the metal clasp. That actually makes sense. The realization was unsettling. You could make an incredibly detailed enchantment if you only needed to distinguish people and collared Pokémon. A thought suddenly occurred to me. Hold on, I wrote, and looked up. What towers? Both agents blinked. This is the first time I've heard about them. I tapped the slate with a frown. Janassa, the younger of the two, exchanged a glance with Minerva before speaking. The Jiaosharan army has been erecting magical defense towers throughout the territory they occupied. His voice got cold. There was an attempt to retake one of the occupied towns. He stopped there. I studied his face for a moment before quietly sitting down beside the fire. I take it didn't go well. Janassa didn't answer. He merely lowered his eyes and gave a single, silent shake of his head. No one spoke after that. The crackling of the campfire became the only sound beneath the night sky, as each of us quietly contemplated the road ahead. 3 days remained, and somehow they suddenly felt far too few. Robert and Fennekin kept to the main road, avoiding every smaller town and even the larger cities whenever possible. There was no reason to take unnecessary risks. The carriage had proven to be a blessing, as the previous owners had packed enough supplies for a long journey. There was plenty of food, fresh water, and even a few bottles of expensive wine, though neither of them had any intention of touching those. Finding the capital wasn't difficult either. Every major crossroads was marked with sturdy wooden signs pointing toward Ragefire. "We'll arrive in Ragefire by tomorrow evening," Fennekin said with a small smile. "Yeah? But then what?" Robert sighed. "We have a whole herd of Pokémon with us. Someone is bound to ask questions. We can send Noctowl and Swellow into the sky, but Primarina will definitely cause a scene if she's seen. There has to be a waterway running through the capital," Fennekin replied, gently petting Ninetails. "A city that large can't rely only on wells or people carrying water. Before we enter, we should circle around and see if there's a canal or river we can use." "Agreed," Robert nodded. "This is one of those moments when I envy people who own crystal Pokeballs." Fennekin's eyes suddenly lit up. "I am an idiot." She quickly pulled her backpack onto her lap and rummaged through it until she found the small pouch Ventis had left behind at the second front. After Ventis's disappearance, it had been delivered to Fennekin as the acting master mage. Opening it, she smiled triumphantly. I knew she still had them. She pulled out 2 crystal Pokeballs, their carved symbols glimmering in the afternoon sunlight. "Primarina, we can sneak you into the capital with this. Then I'll take the other one for Gogoat," Robert said with a grin. "He's the other Pokémon that's a bit too large to casually walk through a city." Primarina looked at the grass type with an encouraging smile. "Don't be afraid. It's a strange feeling, but it doesn't hurt. Is it?" Gogoat eyed the crystal sphere suspiciously before letting out a slow breath. "Very well. I trust you." He gave a slow nod. Robert, Fennekin, and their team reached the outskirts of Ragefire well after sunset. Even beneath the moonlight, the capital was an imposing sight. Thousands of lights illuminated the massive walls, while watchtowers stood like silent guardians, overlooking every road leading into the city. Rather than approaching immediately, they guided the carriage into a nearby forest, carefully hiding it beneath thick branches and overgrown bushes. There was no point in drawing attention before they knew what they were walking into. Swellow and Noctowl took to the skies first, climbing until they became little more than dark specks against the stars. Their task was simple: survey the capital and return if they noticed anything unusual. Meanwhile, Fennekin recalled Primarina and Gogoat into the crystal balls and gave one to Robert. "I primed it already. You just need to call his name." She nodded to Robert. The remaining Pokémon, Bisharp, Jolteon, and Ninetails, stayed close to their trainers as they waited in silence. Nearly an hour passed before the two flying types descended from the night sky. They immediately began chirping back and forth, prompting Peliane to glance toward Ninetails. "Could you translate?" The elegant fox listened patiently before relaying what they had discovered. "The capital has several large reservoirs, no channels for a water type," Ninetails explained. "They're filled using enslaved water Pokémon." Peliane frowned. "I do hope they clean that water before it reaches the common folk." She slowly shook her head. "I heard that water created purely through Pokémon can cause health issues if people rely on it for too long. They probably transport the water Pokémon back to the sea so they can recover before bringing them back again. I honestly can't imagine an entire capital relying on that alone." "Would you rather die of thirst?" Robert asked, raising an eyebrow. "Point." There wasn't much else to discuss. Normal amount of guards, and only a watchtower-looking thing placed in the middle of the city. If the scouts hadn't noticed anything suspicious from above, then there was little they could learn by remaining outside any longer. 2 hours later, they returned to the hidden carriage and calmly joined the sparse nighttime traffic, entering Ragefire. The guards at the gate barely spared them a glance, waving them through without so much as checking the wagon. Everything appeared normal. The carriage rolled perhaps 100 meters beyond the gate. Then the night exploded. A blinding bolt of lightning crashed down from the weird-looking metal watchtower, striking Swellow and Noctowl before either Pokémon had time to react. The two flying types were hurled from the roof of the carriage, tumbling across the cobblestones as smoke rose from their scorched feathers. Before anyone could even process what had happened, a massive fireball streaked toward them. Peliane reacted on instinct. A wall of water surged upward to intercept the spell, but the two magics collided with such force that the resulting steam explosion engulfed the carriage. The blast shattered the wooden wagon into countless splinters and threw everyone violently backward toward the city gate. Robert rolled across the stone street, bruised but otherwise unharmed. Peliane wasn't nearly as fortunate. A small wooden shard had buried itself deep into her shin, forcing a cry of pain from her lips as blood quickly stained her trousers. Neither of them had time to recover. Heavy footsteps echoed from every direction as Aura Knights poured into the street. Within seconds, nearly 50 knights and over 24 Pokémon had completely surrounded them, every weapon already drawn and every spell prepared. There wasn't even an opening to escape through. "Chain the spies!" the captain barked with obvious satisfaction. The knights moved as one. Robert barely managed to rise before several soldiers forced him back to the ground. Peliane tried to gather mana, only for anti-magic shackles to snap around her wrists before she could complete even the simplest spell. Bishop fought back immediately, but even he couldn't overcome such overwhelming numbers. Jolteon and Ninetails were restrained moments later. Nearby, Noctowl and Swellow lay motionless where they had fallen, their feathers still smoking from the lightning strike. To Peliane's surprise, one of the Jiaosharan soldiers uncorked a weak healing potion and carefully poured it into each bird's beak before fitting heavy military collars around their necks. The rest of their Pokémon soon received identical collars. Every bag was searched, every weapon confiscated. Even the crystal balls were taken into the big bag of a knight. Robert sat silently as iron chains were fastened around his wrists. It didn't make sense. They had avoided every town, hidden the carriage, scouted the city from above, entered with perfect disguises. Yet they had been discovered the instant they crossed the gate, as if someone had been waiting for them. The pot-bellied captain strolled over, grinning from ear to ear as he looked over them. The king was expecting a rescue party. He chuckled to himself before gesturing for the prisoners to be hauled to their feet. "Be grateful His Majesty wishes to see you before your execution, Vermont scum. Otherwise, me and the boys would have had our fun with you first." With a lazy wave of his hand, the column of prisoners was marched deeper into the capital, leaving the shattered remains of the carriage scattered across the street. Ventis heard the hard footsteps on the corridor and thanked her preparedness that she sent Roran and his mother to their own room last night. King Calith stepped inside with a satisfied smile on his face. In one hand, he casually toyed with a crystal ball, rolling it across his fingers as though it were nothing more than a trinket. "I have good news," he said, his smile widening. "We captured your master, your ex-husband, and most of your Pokémon." Ventis froze and her heart sank. Calith chuckled at the look on her face. "They'll be attending our wedding as honored witnesses." His smile slowly twisted into something far darker. "Afterward, I'll have them executed." He took another slow step into the room. "Perhaps I'll even grant you the privilege of twisting the knife yourself." He laughed quietly. "Wouldn't that be just ironic? Imagine their faces as they are killed by the very person they tried to rescue." Without another word, he casually tossed the crystal ball toward the bed. It landed softly on the blankets. "Enjoy your Pokémon while you can," Calith said as he turned toward the door. "After we're married, you won't be seeing her again." The door closed behind him. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then, slam! Her fist met the stone wall with all the strength she could muster. Pain shot through her hand as the skin across her knuckles split open, crimson blood slowly running down her fingers. She didn't even notice. Her entire body trembled with barely restrained rage. After taking several deep breaths, she slowly picked up the crystal ball with shaking hands. A flash of light filled the room. Primarina practically launched herself across the room, wrapping both arms around Ventis in a desperate hug. "I missed you too," Ventis whispered, immediately hugging her back. The water type buried her face into Ventis's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably until her tears soaked through both of their clothes and the edge of the bed beneath them. "Don't worry," Ventis said softly as she gently stroked her partner's hair. "It's going to be okay." Only then did she notice the collar. Heavy iron wrapped tightly around Primarina's neck, engraved with countless tiny runes. Ventis's expression darkened. She examined the design slowly. It wasn't an ordinary restraint. The collar could only be unlocked with its matching key. Any attempt to force it open, or even tamper with it using magic, would immediately kill the Pokémon wearing it. The sheer cruelty required to create such a device only fueled the anger burning inside her. Several long minutes passed before Primarina's sobs finally began to quiet. Ventis gently wiped away the water type's tears before leaning closer. "I'm not really under the king's control," she whispered. "Fenn is coming. She's with King Callister's agents. They'll get us out of here." Primarina looked up, hope slowly returning to her eyes. Ventis closed her own. "Fenn?" The response came almost instantly. "Yes, Robert and Pelliene have been captured, along with the others. Calith plans to have them watch the wedding." There was a brief pause. "Then that's when we strike," Fenn answered without hesitation. "My thoughts exactly." Ventis glanced down at Primarina's collar. "I bet they didn't know about the identification plates," Fenn muttered. "Possibly." Ventis agreed. "The collars can only be removed with a specific key. Any tampering or magic will kill the Pokémon wearing them. I also suspect Robert and Pelliene are wearing anti-magic cuffs." There was a brief silence as Fenn relayed everything to the agents traveling with her. "Got it," she finally replied. "We're almost there. We managed to steal a few Rapidashes, so we'll reach Ragefire by nightfall." A small smile appeared on Ventis's face despite everything. "Be careful," she warned. "I imagine the capital is crawling with guards after capturing Robert's team." "We will." Ventis opened her eyes once more before gently returning her attention to Primarina, quietly stroking the water type's hair as the two of them waited for night to fall. Getting into the capital was a breeze. We passed several guard posts without even being looked at. Talonflame landed atop a manor in the noble district, his task being to casually switch positions every so often so no one would suspect a Pokémon lingering in one place for too long. Kadabra and Hypno were given enchanted cloaks before being teleported into the royal gardens. Meanwhile, the two royal agents, Minerna and Janasa, put on illusion rings, much like mine. That being said, theirs were far more advanced. Both rings were prototypes originally intended for future use, but the current situation had forced the Magic Research Institute to hand them over. Archmage Gehatu himself had charged them with mana before they left. Besides changing the wearer's appearance, they could perfectly copy the appearance, voice, and even mannerisms of a scanned person. Hypno's role was just as important. He would use his psychic abilities to transfer the memories of the captured Zhao Sharan soldiers into the minds of our two agents. Routes through the palace, passwords, guard rotations, habits, everything those soldiers knew would now available to Minerna and Janassa. As we approached the palace gates, two palace guards stepped forward and motioned for us to follow them. The gate guards looked at us with raised eyebrows, but seeing the palace guards acting completely normally, they simply waved us through without another question. 10 minutes later, inside a small guardhouse, those same two palace guards collapsed unconscious onto the wooden floor beside Hypno. "Good job, buddy." Janassa laughed, giving the psychic type a high five. Hypno accepted it with an amused smile before casually waving him off. "Dude," Kadabra looked at the sleeping guards before turning to me. "This guy is 10 times better at messing with minds than I am. I honestly thought we were screwed, but he got both of them with a single skill." "Good." I nodded. "Did anyone see you?" Kadabra simply shook his head. I remained outside in the corridor, keeping watch in case anyone approached, while the others got to work. Just as planned, Hypno reached into the unconscious guards' minds, allowing Minerna and Janassa to absorb their memories. When they finished, Kadabra teleported the two unconscious men to an abandoned hunting lodge near a small village close to the border. Gagged and securely tied up, they wouldn't be found anytime soon. A few minutes later, Kadabra returned, grinning. "How do I look?" Minerna asked. I turned around. Standing before me was no longer the border soldier, but one of the palace guards. He adjusted his helmet while speaking with a completely different voice. I couldn't help but smirk. Minerna sighed. I also learned that the keys for the rescue team and their Pokémon are held by only 2 high-ranking officers. Getting those will be tricky. Janassa also frowned as he finished fastening his own armor. There's another problem. Every palace Pokémon is well known by the guards and carries special identification markers. It's not like we can simply walk you inside. Talonflame and you guys would stand out immediately. I quietly pulled my slate from my pack. "Shouldn't I just remove the illusion ring and wear a palace sigil instead?" I asked. A Braixen wandering around the palace wouldn't look that strange. Both agents immediately shook their heads. "No," Janassa answered. "The Fennekin line is restricted. They're either kept inside the royal breeding facilities or wandering the northern palace corridors. A random Braixen appearing elsewhere would attract attention almost immediately." "Right." I turned toward Kadabra. "How accurately can you teleport if you have the guards' memories?" Before Kadabra could answer, Hypno clapped his hands together. "Smart." Kadabra grinned. "With memories? Easy as pie. If I know exactly where I'm going, I can get us there without a problem." He paused. "But if anyone sees us appear out of thin air, we're royally screwed," I finished. Kadabra nodded. "Exactly." I gritted my teeth. He was right. Still, every minute we spent planning was another minute closer to the wedding and death of our friends. The next 2 hours we spent planning, while sadly both Janissa and Minerna had to hurry back to the garden posts so no one would find it awkward that Duo had left. Thanks to Hypno, Kadabra now carried a complete map of the royal castle in his mind. Every corridor, staircase, servant passage, and hidden doorway had been transferred from the memories of the captured guards. While Kadabra sorted through the flood of information, Hypno rummaged through one of the agent's backpacks before pulling out a small jar of enchanted paint and a thin brush. "Hold still." I frowned but obeyed. With careful strokes, Hypno painted the royal crest of Zhao Sharan onto the fur on my shoulder. Honestly, I would have rather been spat on than have that symbol on me. Still, if wearing it helped rescue Ventis, I could stomach the humiliation. In the memories of those 2 guards, I found something useful. Hypno said with a satisfied nod as he packed the paint away. "There's one place inside the royal family's section that the Fennekin line rarely visits, despite technically being part of their territory." Kadabra immediately grinned. "The Pokémon bathhouse." I snickered and shook my head. Gee, I wonder why. Even Hypno couldn't suppress a chuckle. "Are you ready?" Kadabra asked. "No, but I have to go anyway." I cracked my neck before pushing my wand deep into my tail. In its place, I slid an ordinary stick, letting it protrude just enough to resemble what any normal Bratian carried. A heartbeat later, the world blurred around me. The next moment, we stood inside a small bathhouse tucked away in one of the palace wings. Warm steam drifted lazily through the room as several stone pools quietly bubbled beneath enchanted pipes carrying heated water. Towels were stacked neatly on wooden shelves, and the faint scent of herbs lingered in the air. Before I could take in much more, Kadabra vanished just as quickly as he had arrived with me. It was late into the night, exactly when we had expected the bathhouse to be empty. Thankfully, I was alone, for about 4 seconds. The wooden door slid open. A Delphox stepped inside with a towel draped over one shoulder. He took one look at me and froze, and so did I. Several floors beneath the palace, Robert and Pelien sat in opposite prison cells. Neither had even been given the chance to dust themselves off after the explosion. Soot still covered their clothes. Dried blood stained Peliene's trouser leg around the place where she had the splinter lodged in her shin, and both of them were chained to heavy iron rings fixed into the stone floor. At least their hands had been bound in front of them instead of behind, giving them a little freedom of movement. Their meal consisted of half a loaf of stale bread and a cup of water that tasted exactly as Peliene had feared. "It tastes like someone soaked paper in it for half a day," she muttered after taking a sip. Robert couldn't argue. Silence settled over the dungeon until Peliene quietly spoke again. "This feels awful." "I know," Robert sighed. "Not exactly how we planned this." "Not that." She slowly turned her attention toward the adjoining cell. "I can still feel Ninetails. Her mind is being suppressed so heavily that I can barely even speak to her anymore. Because of the bond they shared, Peliene could still sense the fox's thoughts, or rather, the lack of them." Robert followed her gaze. Bisharp sat perfectly still. Jolteon lay motionless beside him. Even Swallow and Noctowl, despite receiving treatment for their injuries, stared blankly ahead. It reminded Robert far too much of the Tauros and Miltank they had seen in Vermont. Alive, obedient, but with almost no free will remaining. He quietly tested the heavy chains binding his wrists before giving up. Even an accomplished Aura Knight would struggle to break restraints like these. "Any ideas?" he whispered. Peliene glanced toward the guards farther down the corridor before leaning forward, letting her long hair completely cover her hands. She pulled one lock into her mouth and carefully worked something free with her tongue. A tiny metal object dropped into her palm. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary hairpin. Using her thumbnail, she carefully scratched away a painted rune. The moment it disappeared, the hairpin unfolded into a compact, enchanted multi-tool filled with delicate lockpicks and rune probes. Robert stared at it in disbelief. "Since when do you have something like that?" Peliene smiled. "I wasn't always a master mage. Back when I was only an adept, I occasionally found myself sneaking into places my rank didn't exactly allow." Keeping her hair draped over her arms to hide every movement, she guided one of the tiny enchanted picks toward the lock on her anti-magic cuffs. Ventis was not simply reading books. Since the prince had used the magic contract on her, there was no reason for anyone to suspect that she was acting against him. As far as everyone knew, she was completely bound to the king's will. She, on the other hand, was quietly working on a magic scroll. There was a faint pain in the back of her head was a constant, as this was indeed planned to be used against the king. Scroll-making was one of the higher studies of enchanting, and exactly what she had been burning the midnight oil to learn in the Jiao Sharan library. First, she needed to create the spell itself, then combine it with our otherworldly knowledge, and finally, inscribe the spell onto specially treated parchment. Thanks to the combination of our magic, she could place a spell on the scroll that was nearly 15 times stronger than what she could have created alone. Now that I was nearby, and their magic could properly combine, Ventis had been working harder than ever. The biggest issue was size. She needed the scroll to be small enough to hide beneath her wedding gown without anyone noticing it. "Miss Ventis?" Ventis nearly jumped at the voice. Rayla was walking down the library corridor, already looking exhausted after the long day. She stopped beside the table and glanced at the mountain of books surrounding Ventis. "I'm going to sleep. Don't worry about putting all those books away tonight." She stretched before continuing down the corridor. "Good night," Ventis whispered. "Good night, Miss Ventis." Rayla disappeared around the corner. Ventis waited several seconds before finally relaxing. Her stiff hand slowly loosened as she pulled the parchment from underneath the book she had hastily placed over it. She carefully inspected the half-finished spell, making sure none of the ink had smeared before continuing. Her fingers moved across the parchment as she completed the final parts of the spell circle. It took several more minutes before the last line was finally connected. Ventis leaned back and let out a quiet sigh. "This should give us a little time." She looked down at the finished scroll. Hopefully. She carefully rolled it up and pushed it beneath her clothes, making sure it was hidden before gathering the books around her. Elsewhere in the castle, Delphox 7 was having a terrible day. He had once belonged to the late King Rhaegus, and now that eternal twink of a bastard, Calith, sat upon the throne. As a Pokémon belonging to the royal family, 7 had enjoyed many privileges that ordinary Pokémon could never dream of. His relationship with Rhaegus had never been one of friendship. It was something deeper in its own way. Respect, loyalty, and the bond that came from serving the same king for many decades. 7 still couldn't accept Rhaegus's death. No matter how many times he thought about that night, something didn't add up. He hadn't smelled any unfamiliar scent around the late king's tent, even after his death. He was almost certain the killer had been from Jaushara itself, and he expected Calith for it. The human could fool other humans with his smiles and carefully chosen words, but Pokémon possessed senses that went beyond simple appearances. 7 could smell lies in the way a person moved, in the tension of their body, in the faint changes of their scent. Calith faked most of the time all his emotions, yet 7 had been placed under his command anyway. That alone was enough to infuriate him. He needed some time alone to cool his head, so he decided to spend some time in one of the Pokémon bathhouses. He made sure to go when he would be alone to be sure. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed Abrasion standing beside the towel rack. 7 stopped out of surprise, then sniffed the air as a scent hit his nose. The herbal scent of the bath was strong, but beneath it he could clearly smell the Abrasion. She was new, which was impossible. 7 stared at her for another moment before taking another breath. Her scent was different, wild almost, strong and healthy, with a natural scent that didn't belong to any Pokémon he had encountered inside the palace. She wasn't even in heat, yet something about her scent was strangely intoxicating. 7 quickly shook his head, forcing himself to focus. Something was wrong. "W, who are you?" he asked, with a frown. I cursed my bad luck. It was very late afternoon, almost nighttime, and there just had to be one dumb Pokémon coming here right when I popped in. It was fine. I could play this. "Sorry, I didn't expect you to come. I'll just leave you to your bath." I smiled and walked toward the door, but the Delphox stepped in front of me. "Shit!" I cursed in my head. If we fought, I would likely win, but the moment we started throwing moves around, every soul in the castle would know something was wrong. "You are not from our breed," the male Delphox smirked. "But I might not alert anyone if you introduce yourself." I screamed mentally but made sure none of it showed on my face. "Let's play it cool." "How can you tell?" I asked innocently. "Your scent. If there was a Braixen like you here, I would have known." He chuckled before taking another breath. "Also," he swallowed hard, "your body looks tense, like you were ready to fight, and those muscles, and healthy fur." He stopped himself and licked his muzzle. "Damn, girl! What did your master make you do to get so lean and strong?" His tail shuddered slightly. "Is this male coming onto me?" I realized, my heart dropping even more than it would have if he had simply alerted the guards. Please don't say such things." I finally spoke, my own heart beating like a drum solo. He was good-looking and tall, with a voice that sounded like some Hollywood actor. "Fuck!" I yelled inside my head. as I realized my Pokémon hormones were making my mind wander. Seemingly realizing it too, he shook his head and forced himself back onto the actual problem. Right, returning to the problem. Who are you? And don't lie, or else I alert the castle. Doesn't your collar make you do that? I asked. Huh? Oh no! His hand stopped near the collar around his neck. This simply makes it impossible for me to hurt anyone unless ordered to, and forces me to follow the orders of the king, no matter how much I despise that arrogant asshole. Even he seemed shocked by what he had just said. Oh? I purred with a grin. Tell me more about just how much you don't like him. If acting like an interested female could help me get an insider ally, then so be it. Well, his ears flicked backward before he suddenly frowned. Hey, you are stalling. Oh, sorry. I gave him an innocent smile. Call me Fenn. I am the Pokémon of the soon-to-be third wife of that arrogant asshole. I winked. No way. You are that one? He took a step closer, looking at me with renewed interest. You? Oh, but you are definitely not from our close breed. I thought there were no Fennekin line Pokémon outside this castle. It's a long story, and I'm not sharing on that front, I chuckled. So what would happen if, say, someone? I disappeared from his view with extreme speed and appeared behind him, holding his fancy ruby-crested collar in my paw. Were to remove this? I played with the collar, examining the excellent enchantment work that had been placed into it. You? How? He gasped. Your collar should stop you from removing the collar of others' Pokémon. Oh, this thing? I gently unclasped mine and held it up. It's only for show. I casually put it back on again. He reached for his neck, gently smoothing the fur where the collar had been. A mark remained around his neck, showing exactly where it had rested for who knew how long. His eyes almost glistened as he looked at me. Don't go crying on me. I rolled my eyes, even though I understood what it might feel like. Hell, Kadabra had broken down crying when I removed his collar back then. Could you do this for the others too? He asked, a shine appearing in his eyes. I could. I nodded. But wouldn't that cause a massive problem? Also, now you can too. I almost laughed when I realized he was still thinking like a servant despite no longer being completely bound by the collar. Although I have a better idea. I smirked and raised one claw toward his collar. Thanks to everything I had learned beside Ventis, I knew exactly which lines of the enchantment served which purpose. Completely removing the collar would be risky, but disabling the restrictions was simple. I carefully scratched away several of the runic lines, breaking the enchantments that forced obedience while leaving the rest intact. I looked at him and smiled. This meeting might have just become a massive boon to our prison break. As the day before the wedding would came, I was in the Pokémon breeding grounds, doing my best to act like I belonged there. I made sure to avoid the human workers as much as possible, only giving them a polite nod whenever I had no choice but to pass near them. I even joined the other Pokémon during feeding time. The Pokechow was reasonably good. Nothing worth writing home about, but at least I wasn't going hungry. While I pretended to simply be another royal Pokémon enjoying the day, Seven and I had slowly been working on the collars. We couldn't risk touching the dozens of Fennekins, as any unusual behavior from that many Pokémon would be noticed immediately. Instead, we focused on the 2 other Delphoxes and several of the Braixen. The one Braixen who had grown up alongside Calith was carefully left out of our little secret. There was no telling where his loyalty truly lay, and neither Seven nor I wanted to take that risk. It was slow work, but every collar we changed meant another Pokémon capable of thinking for itself when the time came. Calith sat comfortably inside his private chambers, looking over the final preparations for the wedding with a satisfied smile. His plan was working. Over the past several days, he had deliberately provoked Ventis with his words, slowly pushing her toward desperation. Telling her that he would order the young woman to kill her master and former husband had been especially effective. He wanted her frightened. He wanted her to believe that the only way to save the people she cared about was to call for Fenn and the rescue party. Of course, Calith was not foolish enough to believe that only one group would come for her. The Archmage of Zhao had already been ordered to secretly weave devastating spells into the stones around the Western Wedding Hall. Anyone entering the area would be stepping into a carefully prepared magical trap without even realizing it. 17 of Calith's finest Aura Knights would be present, each accompanied by their strongest Pokémon. They had been instructed to crush any attempt at rescuing Ventis before it could properly begin. Calith himself had prepared 4 enchanted rings, each containing a powerful defensive barrier that could be activated instantly. The Archmage would remain at his side throughout the ceremony, serving as his personal guard, while the 3 Delphoxes who had belonged to his late brother would also be present. Everything had been accounted for. The wedding hall would be surrounded by some of the strongest fighters in Zhao, while the magical defenses would ensure that even a surprise attack would have nowhere to go. Calith leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. It was a perfect trap. Not even a Rattata should have been able to slip away. The western hall of the palace had been richly decorated for the wedding, with expensive fabrics hanging from the walls and flowers arranged along the long corridors leading toward the ceremony. Calith, of course, was enjoying the morning with his main wife in the gardens, as if the marriage was some lax secondary matter that barely deserved his attention. Minerna and Janasa had been slotted into the same garden patrol, their eyes carefully taking glances at the prince whenever they could. They still had not managed to steal the keys for the collars and cuffs. There had simply been no opportunity, and risking the entire plan for a single attempt would have been foolish. Ventis was being handled by 6 maids, all of them working together to fit her into the massive wedding gown. It was absolutely overkill, both in how long the dress was and in how many gemstones had been sewn into it. Slipping the scroll into her sleeve was almost too risky, but she managed to find a moment when her hands could reach her other clothes. Hundreds of attempts in her room in front of the mirror had trained her fingers to move with surprising speed, and the scroll disappeared beneath the fabric before any of the maids noticed. At the same time, I made sure that the 3 male Delphoxes would not suddenly decide to jump in and help the current king. If anything, I even told them about Rhaegus's child. The information had certainly gotten their attention, and I could only hope that knowing the former king had left behind a son would be enough to make them question where their loyalty truly belonged. I even saw Talonflame give his mark. He was our coordinator, circling high above the noble district where he could watch the surrounding area without attracting too much attention. 4, 6, 4. The bird's cry came through the air, harsh and loud, before he quickly flew off again. My sharp ears picked up the muted sound from the noble district. 464, meaning. I paused as I tried to remember our code. Ah, shit, what was that? Oh, right. Aura Knights incoming. Well, that was expected. I listened to his Morse-like cries as they continued, but the number he gave us made me bite my lips. That is a few too many. 17 cries, Minerna muttered. That's likely all the highest-ranking Aura Knights. He shook his head before pulling out a tiny whistle. It had been specially tuned to produce a sound wave that only a hypno could hear, and he blew a short sequence into it. Far above us, inside the castle's bell tower, Hypno's ears suddenly shot up. He listened carefully to the code before immediately pulling Kadabra closer. I need you to send us to the corridor of the Western Hall. Remember that tiny alcove from the guard's memory. Use that. Kadabra nodded, and a moment later they appeared behind a thick curtain hidden inside the corridor. Kadabra carefully peeked out. The last of the Aura Knights was walking past. Together, Hypno and Kadabra focused their psychic power on him. Hypno's gaze hardened as he used his own hypnosis, while Kadabra reinforced it with his psychic abilities. The knight seemed to fight against the influence for a moment, his trained mind refusing to simply give in. But 2 powerful psychic Pokémon against a single human mind was simply too much. Even with his training, he barely managed to maintain his stride as the hypnosis took hold. He continued walking after the others as if nothing had happened. Hypno watched him disappear round the corner before quietly shaking his head. I'm afraid that's all we can do. He nudged Kadabra, who immediately teleported them back into hiding before anyone else could notice they had been there. As noon arrived, the prisoners were dragged into the ceremonial hall with all their Pokémon in chains and collars. They were given the left side at the front, while all the Aura Knights took their places behind them. On the right were the primary and secondary wives, seemingly not even caring about the event. Behind them stood the invited nobles and a few high-ranking military officials. Around the whole ceremony hall stood the 17 Pokémon of the Knights like sentinels. 2 Magmars, several Charmeleons and Charizards, 2 Houndooms, a Blaziken, and even an Ember. The air shimmered from the heat, which was one of the reasons the ceremony was being held in the open. Even so, the temperature in the Western Marriage Hall was already becoming unbearable. The 3 Delphoxes and Calith's favorite Bryxon were all standing near the elevated podium where the king and priest waited. Everything had been prepared perfectly, at least from Calith's perspective. Then Ventis arrived. She walked into the hall wearing a blood-red wedding dress that made her look as if she had been wrapped in flowing magma studded with rubies. The fabric moved almost like liquid with every step, while the intricate patterns woven into it made the entire dress seem alive. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, but Ventis barely noticed them. "Fenn, tell me when. I am ready." Her voice reached me through our link. "I am only a pathway away from you. Use the scroll as soon as you reach Peliene," I replied. I pulled Talonflame's whistle from my tail and gave him the agreed code. A massive Pokémon cry suddenly echoed from the sky. Every head turned upward. A burning rock came hurtling down toward the podium. Then all hell broke loose. The Archmage of Jaushara immediately jumped up from behind the nobles and activated several prepared spells. One barrier appeared above the podium and smashed into the falling boulder, breaking it apart before it could hit anyone, while 2 other spells streaked toward Talonflame. The flying type made sure to remain just outside their range, constantly screaming from the sky to keep their attention focused on him. At the same time, all the Aura Knights jumped into motion, only for 3 of them to be blasted out of the open hall by a powerful wind burst. Pelienne's anti-magic cuffs clattered onto the ground. She looked toward Ventis with a grin. "Nice to see you, Ventis." Ventis didn't answer. She was already activating the scroll. Of course, Calith was still smiling. He pointed toward the prisoners, as if nothing could possibly have gone wrong. Delphox 6, 7, and 8. Kill the prisoners. What happened next erased his smile completely. The 3 fire types leaped forward as expected, but instead of attacking the prisoners, they suddenly turned around with smirks on their faces and aimed directly at Calith. 3 fire blasts erupted. The first of the 4 enchanted rings on Calith's finger shuddered violently as it absorbed the attacks, its barrier flickering from the force. "How dare you!" he shouted, his face twisting with absolute indignation. His outrage only grew when 2 guards from the garden suddenly rushed into the hall and used enchanted magic scrolls against the Archmage. The carefully prepared defenses were being attacked from every direction, and Calith's perfect plan was falling apart right in front of him. The Knight Commander, Black Knight Agon Servunis, watched the chaos unfold. He already knew about Rhaegus's son, even if Ventis and the former concubine had done everything possible to keep the child's existence hidden. He had also seen enough of Calith's rule to understand exactly what kind of king he had become. Helping the man on the throne might preserve his knighthood, but if Calith won, innocent lives would be ruined, simply because they stood in his way. Agon Servunis made the only decision he could, one that would likely tarnish his name as a knight forever. He turned away from his king and toward the opposing side. "Ventis, catch!" He pulled a keyring from his belt and threw it toward the young woman. Ventis's eyes widened as the keys spun through the air toward her. I rushed toward the massive double doors leading into the marriage hall, only to be stopped by a Mian Shao who stepped directly into my path. "Got you. You were the one I was suspicious of." She took a fighting stance. I had neither the time nor the care to fight an arrogant Pokémon. I gently borrowed a tiny amount of Ventis's mana to boost my attack, and looked at her with a grin. "Idiot about to get burned says what?" She looked confused. clearly not expecting the sentence, and out of pure reaction answered, "What?" The very next moment, the fighting type and the poor doors behind her were blown away, crashing into several other enemy Pokémon and accidentally helping our side in the process. For a brief second, I almost imagined a certain dark-skinned elf and his flame bird nodding approvingly at me from across worlds. But I had no time for daydreaming. I burst into the marriage hall and found absolute chaos. Ventis and our team were gathered beneath a magical barrier, attacking outward, while the shield took serious amounts of damage from the attacks raining down on it. Our two agents were dodging spell after spell from an infuriated female archmage, while the Aura Knights were fighting each other, or rather, their commander, alongside another knight who seemed to have a completely blank expression and attacked his teammates along with his Pokémon. I barely had time to take in the scene before a Houndoom tackled me from the side. "You are the traitor's Braixen. I will end you," he shouted. His attack actually landed because I really hadn't been expecting something to come at me from the side. That was rude. I coughed as I pushed myself back up, but at the same time I felt something inside me begin to burn. It was like a tiny sun had suddenly ignited within my chest, the pressure building as though a bottleneck were slowly being loosened. "I'm going to make you regret ever being born." The Houndoom jumped at me. I decided to play baseball with my tail. I activated Iron Tail and spun as aggressively as I had ever spun in my life, putting every bit of strength behind the attack. My tail slammed into the Houndoom with such force that he barely managed to brace himself before his horns cracked from the impact. The dark type was sent flying across the hall and crashed directly into one of the knights. My chest felt like it was going to burst, so I let it. A blinding light suddenly enveloped me, swallowing my entire body. For several seconds I could see nothing, and when the light finally faded, I was standing just as tall as the other three Delphoxes. I barely had time to enjoy my new height, or the impossible amount of power surging through my body, before an Ember came charging toward me. I simply raised my wand from my tail and pointed it at him. "No!" My psychic hit him head-on. The Ember's eyes rolled back almost instantly as the attack slammed into him, and the massive Pokémon collapsed. That had to have been a critical hit. Or maybe I was simply that overpowered now. "7! Get your brothers away from there!" I shouted. The newly freed Delphox immediately moved away with his brothers. "Ventis, now!" I poured half of my newly awakened power into her. The young woman suddenly burst into white-hot flames. Her wedding gown was consumed instantly, but instead of burning her, the flames hardened around her body and transformed into solid mana. She understood what was happening almost immediately, and as the trio of Delphoxes dodged away, Ventis unleashed the spell. "Shield Breaker!" The shout echoed across the marriage hall. Both Calith and the Archmage turned toward her in shock. The lightning spell narrowed into an impossibly small point before striking the king directly. 3 of the 4 enchanted rings on Calith's fingers shattered at once. The remaining barrier cracked apart under the force, and the king was thrown backward into the stone railing hard enough that I was almost certain he had broken several ribs. "You cannot kill me!" he croaked. "Archmage, help me!" 7 defensive spells were already preparing to burst into existence around him, hidden magic circles, activating one after another, but Peliane immediately countered them. She gritted her teeth as she struggled to hold back the higher-tier spells with everything she had. "Ventis, use it! One more shot is all I have." Her voice entered my mind. I looked at her and saw blood beginning to run from her nose. She was using her own life force. Calith barely had time to push himself upright. The final lightning spell pierced directly through his chest. For a moment, the king simply stood there, staring down at the smoking hole where his heart had been. Then his body fell backward into the garden. At the exact same moment, Ventis collapsed. I felt most of my own remaining strength disappear with her, leaving my legs trembling beneath me. "Fenn, come!" Minerva was already running toward us. I barely managed to move before another spell activated. A blinding light enveloped all of us. When my vision returned, I looked around and almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. Everyone was there. Noctowl, Swellow, Jolteon, Primarina, and Gogoat were gathered together, their collars already removed. Peliene stood beside them with the discarded restraints scattered around her. Robert was hugging Ventis, apparently for multiple reasons, though I noticed he had ripped off his own cape to cover her, now that her wedding gown was gone. Kadabra and Hypno were standing to my right, apparently having been teleported in when Minerna gave the signal. Talonflame lay nearby, bruised and exhausted, but thankfully still alive. I was still trying to understand what had just happened when a voice came from my left. So, is it okay if I jumped into your group spell? I turned. 7! I jumped in surprise. The former Royal Delphox gave me an awkward smile. The Vermont Knights were already rushing toward us the moment the teleportation spell faded, several of them carrying potions, bandages, and medical supplies, while others immediately spread out to secure the area. 6 swords were drawn at once, all of them pointing directly at me and 7. "Don't move," one of the knights ordered. 7 raised both paws slowly, looking more confused than threatening. I'm not going anywhere," he spoke in Pokémon. "Lower your weapons," Minerna shouted as he stepped between us and the knights. "That Delphox is with us." The knights hesitated, but their swords remained raised. "Which one?" Minerna pointed toward me. "That one is Fenn, the Bracian we've been searching for. The other." He glanced toward 7. The other simply jumped into the teleportation spell when we activated it. 7 raised a paw slightly. The knights exchanged suspicious looks before finally lowering their blades. "We'll separate him from the others," one of them said. 7 was carefully escorted away, though thankfully no one treated him like a prisoner. Instead, after a short discussion between the knights and Minerna, it was decided that he would be placed under house arrest until they could determine exactly where he stood. I barely had time to think about that before someone approached me. "Let me see you." The voice belonged to an old man wearing the robes of a high-ranking mage. He looked remarkably similar to Archmage Gahatu, though slightly younger. "Samil Cavelis," Minerna explained quickly. "He's one of our best battlefield healers." I held still as he examined me, checking my eyes, fur, limbs, and the strange surge of power that had recently changed my body. "I'm mostly fine," I told him using my magic slate. "Mostly isn't good enough," he replied as he continued his examination. Nearby, the old Archmage Gahatu had already reached Ventis. He immediately pulled out one of the most powerful healing potions he carried. The glass container was filled with a thick, blood-red liquid that almost seemed to glow in his hand. Ventis remained completely unconscious as Gahatu carefully poured the potion into her mouth. "Come on, girl," he muttered quietly. "You are in good hands now." The potion disappeared down her throat, and Gahatu watched her carefully before finally allowing himself to relax. "We'll need to keep her under observation." The following hours became a blur of movement. The wounded were treated, the captured Zhao Sharon soldiers were secured, and the surviving Pokémon were checked one after another. The teleportation had brought us directly into a secure section of the Vermont-controlled forces, where we could finally breathe without expecting another attack. Eventually, I was brought into a massive royal chamber that had been prepared for us. Kadabra, Hypno, Primarina, Ninetales, Jolteon, Noctowl, Swellow, and the others were gathered there with me, all of us finally free from the immediate danger. Robert remained in another room with Ventis so that she could be watched by the healers without having too many people crowding around her. For the first time since entering Ragefire, I finally had a moment to sit down. I looked around at my team. Everyone looked exhausted. Some were bruised, some had torn fur or feathers, and several still had the marks left behind by the Zhao Sharon collars. But we were alive. We had made it out, and now I had a lot of explaining to do. It was pretty awkward, to be honest. Noctowl and Swellow still looked like shit, their whole bodies covered in bandages like mummies. From what I learned, they had nearly died from a lightning spell. Jolteon had a massive scar along his back, one that I also didn't remember him getting. The only one in the group who didn't have some painful reminder was Primarina. Hell, even I had a stab mark on my hip, though it had become much less visible after evolving, barely more than a shift in my fur pattern. "So, nice to see you guys again," I said, sitting down. "Yeah." Jolteon nodded as he slowly walked toward me. "It's good to have you back, even if you've changed a bit." "A bit," he says. I chuckled and gave him a nuggie. "I see you envied Umbreon's 6th scar and got one for yourself." "Oh, you noticed?" He grinned. "Pretty slick, is it? Noctowl? Swellow? How are you guys holding up?" I asked as I took hesitant steps toward the 2 birds. "I think after this I should retire." Swellow shook his head. "I will survive." Noctowl pushed out his chest, only to wince immediately. "I am an alpha. This is nothing." He forced a smile. "Well, in any case," I pulled out my wand and used Heal Pulse with maximum power. Both birds visibly relaxed as the healing energy washed over them, their tense bodies finally loosening. Then, completely out of the blue, quite literally, Primarina slammed into me with a hug. "I was so worried about you," she cried over my shoulder. "I am fine. In all honesty, I never once questioned that you guys would be all right, and I was right-ish," I smirked as I petted the water type's back. After that came my turn to tell them everything that had happened. I explained how Kadabra and I had found ourselves at the bottom of the Canarian Islands, how we had ended up forming the Foxtail Pirates, getting dragged into an arena, being blessed by a shamaness, and eventually making our way to the Jiaosharan Palace with my team of agents. In turn, they told me how they hadn't hesitated for a moment in forming a rescue party, how they had reached the north, saved a Dragonite mother, fought an Abomasnow and its gang, and then sneaked into Jiaoshara from the north, only to end up being ambushed by one of the magical towers. It's crazy to think that all of that happened in less than 2 months. I leaned back, still having trouble getting used to my new height and perspective. With night approaching, I opened my connection to Ventis and felt her presence through our bond. I sent some of my energy through it as well before visiting her in person and using my healing on her. Sadly, this wasn't really a wound that could be healed. She had simply burned a year or 2 of her own life energy, and being knocked unconscious after using 2 of her absolute strongest spells was hardly surprising. I stayed beside her for a while, making sure she was sleeping peacefully. "Sleep well." I gently kissed her forehead before leaving the room. The next day I saw Pelien limping toward me, with Kadabra helping her along. She still had a noticeable limp from the injury she had received during the wedding, but her expression was already much better than I expected. Hanging from her hip was the crystal Pokeball Ventis had made, and the moment I saw it, a crazy idea entered my mind. I pulled out my slate and started writing. "Hey, Pelien, I had a lot of time to think on the way home, and I have a theory. Could you help me with a Pokémon-related test? You are barely back for a day and already planning to blow my mind, huh?" She grinned. "All right, I am all ears. As the resident Pokémon researcher of Velna County, I will gladly help with your test." "So professional," I wrote with a chuckle before turning toward Kadabra. "It involves you too, mate. Want to become stronger?" "Stronger? How?" he asked, clearly confused. "By evolving." I shrugged. "Evolving? But there is no evolution from a Kadabra." He shook his head. "Wanna bet?" I smirked, then added, "Just roll with it." I turned back toward Pelien and quickly wrote down my theory. "So, I think there is another evolution for the Abra line. All you need to do is use the crystal Pokeball on him, then give the ball to another person and have that person release him." "You are kidding!" Her eyes widened before she suddenly turned around and yelled, "Archmage!" Gehatu almost had a heart attack in his temporary room when the shout echoed through the corridor. He hurried toward the noise, clearly expecting some sort of emergency, only to find a smug-looking woman standing beside me. "What happened?" he asked, looking around for a threat. "Oh, nothing yet, but I didn't want to look for you." Pelien grinned. "Oh, Miss Foamcrest," Gehatu frowned. You haven't changed a bit since the time I was your headmaster. Here." She handed him the crystal pokeball. "Use it to release Kadabra." She offered no further explanation. "If this is one of your tricks." Gehatu sighed, but did as she asked. The moment Kadabra emerged from the crystal ball, his entire body was engulfed in brilliant light. Both humans stared as his form began to change. His body grew larger, his ears became more pronounced, and when the light finally faded, a completely different Pokémon stood before them. Alakazam looked down at himself for several seconds before a massive grin spread across his face. "Oh, yeah." He raised both hands and his 2 spoons immediately floated beside him. "How? How did? Oh, yeah. Another world." He suddenly pointed 1 spoon at me. "You still owe me that explanation." I simply grinned at him. Behind me, Peliene and Gehatu looked as though someone had just punched them both in the stomach. Then their expressions changed. The shock was replaced by pure fascination. Within seconds, the 2 mages were already examining Alakazam from every possible angle, nerding out about Pokémon evolutions. When Ventis finally woke, I was the first one to hug her, and for a long time neither of us said anything. We simply stayed there, holding onto each other as if letting go would somehow make everything that had happened come back. "I never want to be this far from you ever again." She buried her face in my fluff. "What is a Pokémon without her trainer?" I smiled as I let the moment last. After me, Robert came in, and the 2 of them had a long talk. Then Peliene and Gehatu came together, followed by the king himself. Poor girl had barely woken up and was already being bombarded by visitors, questions and reports, yet she took it all with a smile. A letter also arrived in the capital from Evelna, mentioning a certain ship, a young man, and 2 Pokémon traveling with him. Good, they made it too. I showed the letter to Alakazam, who immediately smiled. They're going to freak out when they see that we both evolved. He laughed. True, I nodded. Jaushara took a heavy hit from losing yet another ruler. With Calith dead and the kingdom suddenly without an adult heir, the country could no longer maintain the same aggressive stance it had taken during the war. From what we could gather from the reports reaching Vermont, the Knight Commander, Agon Servunis, had taken temporary control of the kingdom and become regent until the baby prince was old enough to rule. It was an unusual arrangement, but at least it kept Jaushara from falling into complete chaos. More importantly, it removed any immediate possibility of Jaushara being the aggressor. King Callister took advantage of the situation and managed to work out a deal with Regent Aegon. The magical towers were to be removed from the territory that had previously belonged to Vermont, and the entire region would instead become a buffer zone between the two kingdoms. A massive number of people who had lost their homes during the war would be given land there, allowing them to rebuild their lives while slowly turning the frontier to a mixed nationality zone. Trade routes would also be established through the buffer zone, giving Jaushara reliable access to food and other necessities. With the Riverlands and Vermont's fertile regions once again connected to their markets, there would be little reason for Jaucharan towns to ever face serious shortages again. In return, Vermont would receive high-quality silver and gold, along with several other valuable minerals that Jaushara possessed in abundance. It was a deal that benefited both sides, especially after so much blood had already been spilled. Of course, none of it would happen overnight. The new border city was still under construction, with foundations being laid and entire caravans of building materials arriving every day. Roads needed to be built, farms planted, and thousands of displaced families still needed somewhere to call home. If both kingdoms managed to keep their promises, there was finally the possibility of a peace that could last for generations. It was almost shocking how easily we managed to slip back into a relatively normal life after everything that had happened. The class was still going strong, which meant we had a lot of catching up to do with the others, but thankfully we were given 2 weeks of rest in Evelna before we had to return. There, we finally met up with the rest of the gang. Terence was working out with Magmar and Graveler, while his Mudbray happily watched from the side. Letherbo was also on the training field, with Chespin and Beniri, all three of them busy with their own training. While Ventis walked around with Peliane and Robert, I decided to visit the training field. "Hey guys, it's been a while." I waved toward them. I barely had time to take another step before I was quite literally tackled by the team. I couldn't help but laugh as everyone crowded around me, asking questions and telling their own stories. Before long, we were all sitting around together, comparing what had happened during our time apart, laughing at the ridiculous moments, and occasionally going quiet when one of the more dangerous memories came up. We kept talking until late into the night. Eventually, I slipped away and found myself sitting alone on the balcony railing beside Ventis's window, quietly watching the stars. The sight brought back memories of the very first night I had spent in this world. Back then, I had been weak, injured, and shivering beneath a cluster of roots, with absolutely no idea where I was or what had happened to me. Those same stars had watched me then. Now, somehow, they looked completely different. Instead of fear and loneliness, they filled me with a strange warmth as my mind wandered back through everything that had happened since that first night. "Are you missing your old world?" Ventis asked, through our connection. She casually leaned against the stone railing beside me, though she immediately shivered as the cold autumn air brushed against her skin. "Not really," I smiled. "I was just thinking about how lucky I was to meet you that day." I gently wrapped my tail around her, letting my warm fur shield her from the cold. Ventis leaned into me with a quiet smile and looked up at the stars. "Me too." "All right, kids. I think it's way past time for you all to go to sleep." I leaned back in my chair, looking over the small group of Pokémon surrounding me. They immediately let out a collective groan. "Come on, just a bit more, Miss Fenn." Deden leaned forward, his little paws gripping the edge of the bed. "You didn't even tell us how my mother evolved," Buniri complained, giving me the biggest puppy eyes she could manage. "I'm okay with sleep," Little Kubchu snorted as he pulled his pillow toward his bed. A few of the others nodded, along with him. "When will you tell us about the Starfall and the legendaries?" Deden asked, as I tucked him into his bed. "Ooh, what about your epic megaform?" Buniri suddenly jumped happily beside me. I simply shook my head and gently petted her head. "There will be another time, don't worry." I smiled as I walked toward the door. "Sleep well, kiddos."